The cantina on Kepler Station was dark and filled with smoke from a dozen different worlds. Strange creatures sat at metal tables, drinking colorful liquids that bubbled and steamed. The air smelled like metal and something sweet that burned. The nose. Commander Zekthara pushed through the crowd with her 4 massive arms. Her thick shell was covered in old battle scars that told stories of 100 fights. Her bug-like eyes looked around the room until she found an empty table near the back. She sat down with a heavy thud that made the whole table shake. The other aliens in the cantina stared at her. They knew who she was. Everyone in this part of the galaxy had heard of Commander Zekthara. She was a Vorthak warrior who had fought in more battles than most soldiers could count. Her people were known for being tough and mean, but even among the Vorthak she was special. A small robot rolled up to her table. It had 6 arms and spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "What drink do you want, Commander?" "Give me something strong," Zekthara said. Her voice was deep and rough like rocks scraping together. "And tell everyone I have stories to share. Stories about the humans." The word humans made every alien in the cantina turn their heads. Some laughed. Others looked scared. Most just looked confused. Humans were new to this part of space. They had only joined the Galactic Coalition a few years ago, and most aliens had never seen one. The robot brought her a tall glass filled with blue liquid that glowed in the dark. Zekthara took a long drink and then stood up. Her 4 arms spread wide as she looked around the room. "Listen up, all of you," she called out. "I know what you think about humans. You think they are weak. You think they are small and soft and easy to break. I thought the same thing once." A creature that looked like a walking crystal laughed. "Humans have no armor, no claws, no poison. What could they possibly do in a real fight?" Zekthara's mandibles clicked together in what might have been a smile. "That is exactly what I said when I first met them. It was during the siege of Proxima Beta. The Ravagers had come to destroy everything on that world. They were big and mean and had weapons that could melt through solid rock." She sat back down and took another drink. The cantina had gone quiet. Even the music had stopped playing. The Coalition sent a mixed force to defend the planet. I was leading my own warriors, and we were ready for a hard fight. But when I saw the human soldiers, I almost laughed out loud. Zekthara held up one of her massive clawed hands. "Look at this, I can crush a metal bar with these fingers. My shell can stop bullets. I have fought creatures twice my size and won." She pointed to where some empty chairs sat. Then I saw Captain Jake Morrison. He was maybe half my height. His skin was soft and pink like a baby's. He carried a simple rifle that shot little metal bullets. When he shook my hand, I was afraid I might break his tiny fingers. A gas creature that floated near the ceiling made a sound like wind blowing through caves. "So the humans ran away when the real fighting started?" "That is what I expected," Zekthara said. "But I was wrong. Very wrong." She closed her eyes and seemed to remember something from far away. "The Ravagers hit us hard. They came in ships as big as buildings, firing weapons that turned sand into glass. Their ground troops were 8 feet tall with armor thicker than my shell. They moved like machines and felt no fear." The cantina was so quiet now that everyone could hear the hum of the station's engines. My warriors and I fell back to the second line of defense. It was the smart thing to do. We could regroup and plan a better attack, but when I looked around, I saw that the humans had not moved. Zekthara opened her eyes and looked straight at the crystal creature who had laughed earlier. Captain Morrison and his soldiers were still in their positions, still firing their little rifles, still fighting even though they were about to die. She stood up again and began to pace around her table. I called out to Morrison on the radio. I told him to fall back. I told him his position was lost. Do you know what he said to me? The aliens in the cantina leaned forward, waiting for the answer. He said, "Commander, we have wounded behind us who cannot move. We will not leave them." Then he turned off his radio and kept fighting. A creature that looked like a giant spider made a clicking sound with its many legs. "That is just stupid. A good soldier knows when to retreat." Zekthara's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. I thought the same thing. so I watched through my scope to see these foolish humans die quickly. She took another drink and wiped her mouth with the back of one huge hand. What I saw instead changed everything I believed about warfare. The commander began to describe the battle in detail. She told them how Lieutenant Amy Clark, a human female who looked like she could not hurt a small animal, had run straight into enemy fire to drag a wounded alien soldier to safety. How she had done this not once, but 5 times, each time risking her own life for someone she had never met before. Clark was not even a medic, Zekthara explained. She was just a soldier who saw someone who needed help. When a piece of shrapnel cut open her arm, she wrapped it with her own shirt and kept fighting. She described how the human medics worked during the battle. While explosions went off all around them, they crawled from soldier to soldier, treating wounds and giving comfort to the dying. They helped humans and aliens equally, never asking what species someone was before giving aid. I watched one medic, a young man named Pete Davis, work for 3 hours straight while enemy shells fell around him like rain. His hands were covered in blood, his uniform was torn, but he never stopped. He saved 17 lives that day. 14 of them were not even human. The aliens in the cantina began to mutter among themselves. This was not what they expected to hear about the soft, weak humans. Zekthara continued her story. She told them about the moment when the Ravagers broke through the human line. Instead of running or surrendering, the humans did something that made no sense to any military manual ever written. They charged, she said simply. 43 humans with their little rifles and no armor charged straight at 200 Ravagers, armed with plasma cannons and energy shields. The spider creature made that clicking sound again. That is not brave, that is just insane. Yes, Zekthara agreed. It was insane. It was also the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in war. She described how Captain Morrison led the charge, running straight into enemy fire while shouting something humans called a battle cry. How Lieutenant Clark threw herself on top of a grenade to protect the soldiers around her, taking wounds that should have killed her but somehow surviving. How every single human soldier fought like they were protecting their own families instead of a bunch of strangers on a planet they had never seen before. The charge should have failed, Zekthara said. By every rule of warfare, those humans should have died in the first 30 seconds. But something happened that I still do not understand. She paused and looked around the room. Every alien was staring at her with wide eyes or whatever they used for seeing. The Ravagers stopped shooting. The cantina erupted in confused voices. Several aliens shouted questions at once, but Zekthara held up her hands for silence. I was watching through my long-range scope. I saw it happen. The Ravagers just stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, they stood there like statues while the humans ran straight at them. It was like they could not believe what they were seeing. She sat back down and finished her drink. Those 10 seconds were enough. The humans reached the Ravager line and the real fighting began. Up close, where their small size and quick movement gave them advantages, where their willingness to die for each other became a weapon more powerful than any gun. Zekthara looked up at the floating gas creature. The humans won that battle, not because they were stronger or had better weapons. They won because they fought like no other species in the galaxy fights. They fought like every life mattered more than their own. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background hum of the station seemed quieter. That was my first lesson about humans, Zekthara said. I learned that day that there are worse things than dying in battle. There are worse things than losing a fight. The worst thing is giving up when someone is counting on you to keep fighting. She signaled the robot for another drink. And that was just the beginning of what these humans taught me about war. The robot brought Zekthara another glowing drink. She held it up and looked at the blue liquid swirling inside the glass. The cantina was still quiet, with every alien waiting for her to continue her stories about the humans. After Proxima Beta, I thought I understood these strange creatures, she said. I thought their secret was just being willing to die for others. But then came the Battle of the Crimson Nebula, and I learned that humans have many more surprises. She took a sip and set the glass down with a soft clink. The Void Collective had been moving through our space like a disease. They are old, older than any of our species. They look like living shadows made of pure energy. When they attack a world, they drain all the life from it, until nothing is left but dead rock floating in space. A creature that looked like a walking tree made a sound like wind through leaves. The Void Collective cannot be defeated. They have destroyed entire star systems. That is what everyone said, Zekthara agreed. They had already taken 12 worlds. Coalition High Command was ready to abandon the whole sector and fall back to a safer position. But the humans had a different idea. She stood up and began walking around her table again, her forearms moving as she talked. I was assigned to work with the human fleet. Their leader was Colonel Ben Harper, a man with gray hair and eyes like ice. When I met him, he was looking at star charts with his officers. They were planning something that made no sense. Zekthara pointed to an empty spot on her table as if it was a map. The Void Collective had 3 times as many ships as we did. Their weapons could tear through our shields like paper. Any smart commander would try to avoid a direct fight, but Harper was not planning to avoid anything. She moved her hands around the imaginary map, showing ship positions. Most species fight wars the same way. We calculate the odds. We make logical plans. We try to minimize our losses and maximize the enemies. But humans think differently about war. The crystal creature from earlier leaned forward. How differently? Harper split his fleet into 7 small groups, Zekthara explained. Each group was too small to win against the Void Collective alone. By every rule of space warfare, this was the worst thing he could do. She sat back down and took another drink. I was assigned to Group 3, commanded by Major Lisa Chen. She was young, maybe 30 Earth years old. When I asked her why we were dividing our forces, she smiled and said something I will never forget. Zekthara paused, looking around the room at all the alien faces watching her. She said, "Commander, the enemy expects us to be logical. They have fought logical opponents for thousands of years. They know exactly what logical enemies will do. So we are going to be completely illogical instead." The spider creature clicked its legs again. That sounds like a good way to lose quickly. That is what I thought too, Zekthara said. But then the battle started, and I saw what human, illogical, really means. She began to describe the battle in detail. The Void Collective had arranged their ships in a perfect defensive formation, exactly what military textbooks said they should do. They were ready for a traditional attack from one direction, or maybe 2 directions if the enemy was clever. Instead, Harper's 7 groups attacked from 7 different directions at exactly the same time. But they did not attack the same targets. Group 1 went after the enemy's communication ships. Group 2 attacked their supply vessels. Group 3, my group, went straight for their command ship. Zekthara's voice grew excited as she remembered the battle. The Void Collective did not know where to focus their defenses. Every time they moved ships to stop one attack, another group would hit them somewhere else. It was like trying to catch 7 different animals that were all running in different directions. She told them about Sergeant Roy Mitchell, who led a squad of human Marines in what they called a suicide run. His job was to fly his small ship straight at the biggest enemy vessel, drawing all their weapons fire to himself. Mitchell knew he was going to die, Zekthara explained. His ship was too small and too slow to escape once the enemy noticed him, but he also knew that while they were shooting at him, they would not be shooting at the rest of us. The floating gas creature made a sound like a whistle. Did he survive? No, Zekthara said quietly. Mitchell died when his ship exploded, but his sacrifice let Major Chen's group get close enough to damage the enemy command ship, and that was exactly what he wanted to happen. She described how engineer Kate Foster had modified their quantum torpedoes in ways that broke several laws of physics. Instead of exploding normally, the torpedoes created tiny black holes that lasted for just a few seconds. The Void Collective had shields that could stop any normal weapon, Zekthara explained. But they had never seen anything like Foster's modified torpedoes. The tiny black holes went right through their shields like they were not even there. The most amazing part of the story came when she described what Commander Steve Walsh did. During the battle, while explosions were going off all around them and enemy ships were firing from every direction, Walsh did something that no military manual had ever suggested. He started playing music, Zekathara said. Human music. Something called rock and roll. The aliens in the cantina looked confused. Several of them asked what rock and roll was, but Zekathara held up her hand. I did not understand it either. The music was loud and chaotic. It had no pattern that made sense. It hurt my ears and made my head ache. But Walsh broadcasted on all frequencies so everyone in the battle could hear it. She paused to take another drink. At first I thought Walsh had lost his mind from battle stress. But then I noticed what the music was doing to the Void Collective. Zekathara explained that the Void Collective communicated through harmonic frequencies, like a song that all their ships sang together. This let them coordinate their movements perfectly and react to threats instantly. But Walsh's rock and roll music disrupted their harmony, she said. The chaotic noise interfered with their communication system. Suddenly their ships were not working together anymore. They were confused and isolated like singers who could not hear the melody they were supposed to follow. The battle turned after that. The perfectly coordinated Void Collective fleet became a group of individual ships that did not know what their neighbors were doing. Human tactics that seemed random and crazy began to make sense. I watched Major Chen lead her ships in something called a barrel roll attack. Zekathara continued. They flew in spinning spirals that should have made them easy targets. But the enemy could not predict where they would be from one second to the next. She told them about Captain Tony Davis, who pretended his ship was badly damaged and drifting helplessly. When 3 enemy vessels came close to finish him off, Davis suddenly powered up all his weapons and destroyed 2 of them before they knew what was happening. Humans call this playing possum, Zekathara explained. They pretend to be weak or dead, then strike when the enemy is not expecting it. No other species would think to use deception this way in the middle of a battle. The fight lasted for 6 hours. By the end, the human fleet had lost 4 ships and taken heavy damage to most of the others. But the Void Collective, who had never lost a battle in recorded history, retreated from the system. After it was over, I asked Major Chen how they knew their crazy plan would work, Zekathara said. She told me something that I think explains how humans approach all of warfare. Every alien in the cantina leaned forward to hear this. Chen said, "We did not know it would work, but we knew that doing what the enemy expected us to do would definitely not work. So we decided to do everything they would never expect instead." Zekathara finished her second drink and signaled for a third. That day I learned that humans do not just adapt to war. They remake war into something completely different. They turn every rule upside down and make their weaknesses into strengths. They win battles not by being better soldiers, but by being impossible to predict. She looked around the cantina at all the different alien species listening to her story. Most of us fight the way our ancestors fought. We use the same tactics, the same strategies, the same thinking that has worked for thousands of years. But humans make up new ways to fight in the middle of battles. They create solutions that have never existed before. The crystal creature spoke up again. But surely this only works once. After enemies see these tricks, they can prepare for them. Zekathara's mandibles clicked in what might have been laughter. That is what I thought too. But then I fought alongside humans in more battles, and I learned something even more amazing. They never use the same trick twice. Every battle, they invent completely new ways to confuse and defeat their enemies. She stood up and raised her glass toward the ceiling. The humans taught me that the greatest weapon in war is not strength or technology or numbers. The greatest weapon is the ability to think of something that no one else has ever thought of before. The cantina was quiet for a moment. Then several aliens raised their own drinks in agreement. They were beginning to understand why this strange, new species had earned so much respect so quickly. But that was still not the most important lesson the humans taught me about warfare, Zekathara said as she sat back down. The real lesson came later, during a battle that almost broke my spirit. The third drink arrived, glowing brighter than the first 2. Zekathara held it between her massive claws and stared into the swirling liquid. The cantina remained silent, every alien waiting to hear what lesson could be more important than the ones she had already shared. "The liberation of Theta Prime," she said quietly. "That is where I learned what humans really fight for. She set the drink down without taking a sip. Theta Prime had been a slave world for over 100 years. The Dominion Empire had conquered it long before any of us were born. They used the native population as workers in their metal mines, treating them worse than animals. The spider creature made a clicking sound. Slave worlds are common in the outer systems. Most species avoid them because freeing slaves is expensive and dangerous. Exactly, Zekthara agreed. The Coalition had marked Theta Prime as a low priority target. The plan was to blockade the system and wait for the Dominion to abandon it eventually. No one wanted to waste resources on a direct assault. She picked up her drink again, but still did not taste it. But the humans had different ideas. Marine Captain Paul Green and Navy Commander Helen Ross volunteered to lead a liberation force. When Coalition Command told them the mission was too dangerous and not worth the cost, Captain Green said something that shocked everyone in the meeting. Zekthara looked around the cantina at all the different alien faces. He said, "With respect, sir, there are 2 million sentient beings on that planet living in chains. Every day we wait is another day of suffering for them. That makes this mission worth any cost." The floating gas creature made a sound like wind through metal. "That is not logical military thinking." "No, it was not," Zekthara said. "Most Coalition species approach liberation missions as strategic objectives. We calculate the value of the territory, the resources we might gain, the political advantages of victory. We treat it like a business transaction." She finally took a sip of her drink and her expression grew serious. "I was assigned to the Human Task Force as a military advisor. When I met Captain Green, I expected him to ask about enemy troop strengths, weapon systems, defensive positions. Instead, he asked me something I had never heard in a military briefing." The crystal creature leaned forward. "What did he ask?" "He asked how many children were in the slave camps. He wanted to know what kind of medical care the prisoners had received. He asked about the nutritional content of the food they were being given and whether there were pregnant females among the workers." Zekthara stood up and began pacing again, her forearms moving as she talked. "I told Green that these details did not matter for military planning. The objective was to defeat the Dominion forces and secure the planet. What happened to the slaves after that was not our concern." She paused and looked directly at the spider creature. Green looked at me like I had said something horrible. He said, "Commander, those people are not a side effect of this mission. They are the entire reason for this mission. Everything else is just details." The cantina grew even quieter as the aliens absorbed this idea. The assault began 3 days later. The Dominion had strong defenses around the planet and a fleet of warships in orbit. By normal military standards, we should have focused on destroying their space forces first, then dealing with ground installations. Zekthara described how the human plan was completely different. Instead of a traditional space battle, they split their objectives into 2 parts: military targets and civilian rescue operations. Commander Ross took half the fleet and engaged the Dominion warships directly. But her real job was not to win the space battle. Her job was to create enough chaos that the enemy would not notice the rescue ships. She told them about the transport vessels that Captain Green had filled with medical supplies, food, and temporary shelters. While the main battle was happening, in orbit these ships were landing on the planet's surface near the slave camps. Most commanders would have sent soldiers to secure the landing zones first, Zekthara explained. But Green sent medics and engineers. His first priority was not military victory, but helping the people who had been suffering for so long. She described her own role in the mission, leading a strike team to capture the main administrative building where the Dominion kept records of all their prisoners. When they broke through the enemy defenses, she expected to find military intelligence or weapon locations. Instead, we found files on every single slave on the planet: medical records, family information, work assignments, punishment records. Green had sent us there not to gain military advantage, but to help reunite families after the liberation. The story continued with details of the ground battle. The Dominion forces were well-equipped and strongly positioned, but they made a crucial mistake. They treated the assault like a normal military operation and focused on defending their important strategic targets. They did not understand that the humans were not fighting a normal war. Zekthara said, While the Dominion was protecting their command centers and weapon depots, the humans were surrounding the slave camps. She told them about Lieutenant Jim Clark, who led a company of Marines straight into the most heavily defended area of the planet, not because there were important military targets there, but because that was where the largest concentration of prisoners was being held. Clark's orders were simple: get the civilians out alive, no matter what the cost. He was not supposed to win territory or capture enemy equipment. His only job was to break open the prison compounds and escort the slaves to safety. The battle became more intense as Zekthara described the fighting around the slave camps. The Dominion guards were trained to kill their prisoners rather than let them escape. Time was running out and every minute of delay meant more innocent deaths. That is when Commander Ross made a decision that still gives me chills, Zekthara said. Her ship was badly damaged from the space battle. The engines were failing, life support was compromised, and the hull had multiple breaches. She paused to take another drink, her hands shaking slightly. The evacuation transports were trapped on the planet's surface by enemy fire. They could not take off with their cargo of rescued slaves. Someone needed to create a distraction big enough to draw the Dominion's attention away from the landing zones. The aliens in the cantina waited breathlessly for what came next. Ross volunteered to pilot her damaged ship through the enemy defensive line. She knew the ship would not survive the run. The odds of making it through were almost zero, but she also knew that the attempt would force every enemy gun to focus on her instead of the transport ships. Zekthara's voice became very quiet. I was on the bridge with her when she made the decision. I told her it was suicide. I told her there had to be another way. I begged her to reconsider. She looked up at the floating gas creature. Ross looked at me with the calmest expression I have ever seen on any being's face. She said, Commander, there are 1,500 children on those transports. If my death means they get to live free, then it is not really death at all. It is the most important thing I will ever do. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background sounds of the station seemed to have stopped. Ross began her attack run. Every weapon on the planet turned toward her ship. Plasma cannons, missile batteries, energy beams that could cut through mountains. All of it focused on one damaged cruiser that was already falling apart. Zekthara described the final moments of the space battle. Ross's ship took hit after hit, pieces of it breaking off and spinning away into space. The bridge was on fire, the artificial gravity had failed, and half the crew was already dead. But she kept flying straight at the enemy command center. Even when the ship was more wreckage than vessel, she held her course. Even when it became clear that she would not survive the next few seconds, she did not deviate from her mission. The commander's voice broke slightly as she continued. Ross's ship exploded just as it reached the enemy fortress. The blast was so big it could be seen from orbit. It destroyed the entire Dominion command structure and created an electromagnetic pulse that disabled their defensive systems. She took a long drink and wiped her eyes with the back of one massive hand. The transport ships took off immediately. All 1,500 children made it safely off the planet, along with over 3,000 adults. The liberation was complete. Zekthara sat back down and looked around the cantina. After the battle, I helped with the refugee processing. I watched human medical teams work around the clock to treat people who had been sick and injured for decades. I saw human engineers building temporary housing and setting up food distribution centers. She described how medic Nancy Wright had worked for 36 hours straight, treating everything from malnutrition to infected wounds to psychological trauma. Wright had not slept or eaten, focusing entirely on helping people who were complete strangers to her. I asked Wright why she was pushing herself so hard. The immediate medical crisis was over. The most serious cases had been treated. She could have rested. The crystal creature spoke up. What did she say? She said, "These people have been hurting for 100 years. I cannot fix all of that, but I can make sure they do not hurt for even one more day than necessary." Zekthara finished her drink and set the glass down with finality. The fourth drink sat untouched in front of Zekthara. She stared at it for a long time before speaking again. When she finally looked up at the aliens around her, they could see something different in her eyes. something that looked like old pain. "The Battle of the Shattered Worlds," she said in a voice so quiet that everyone had to lean forward to hear her. "That is where I learned the true price of human honor." She picked up the glass but did not drink from it. Her 4 hands trembled, slightly as she held it. The plague swarm had come from beyond the galactic rim. They were not like any enemy we had faced before. They did not want territory or resources or slaves. They wanted to consume everything that lived and turn it into more of themselves. The crystal creature made a sound like breaking glass. The plague swarm destroyed 3 entire star systems before anyone could stop them. "More than 3, Zekthara corrected. By the time we understood what we were facing, they had already consumed dozens of worlds. Billions of beings had been turned into biomechanical nightmares that served the swarm's hunger. She finally took a small sip of her drink. Coalition High Command called an emergency meeting. Representatives from every major species gathered to discuss our response. The reports from the front lines were terrifying. Zekthara described the plague swarm ships, which were not built but grown from living tissue and metal fused together. They could repair themselves by consuming any organic matter they encountered. They could adapt to new weapons within hours of first seeing them used. The swarm was moving toward 3 populated systems: Kepler-7, New Geneva, and the Arcturus colony. Each system had millions of civilians who could not be evacuated in time. She set her drink down and looked around the cantina. Coalition Command made a decision that followed all the rules of military logic. They declared the 3 systems to be acceptable losses and ordered all military forces to fall back to a more defensible position. The floating gas creature made a whistling sound. That was the smart thing to do. You cannot save everyone in war. That is exactly what the coalition leaders said, Zekthara agreed. Cut our losses, save what we can, regroup and plan a counterattack from a position of strength. Every military manual ever written would have supported that decision. She paused and looked directly at the gas creature. The humans refused the order. The cantina erupted in confused voices. Several aliens spoke at once, asking how anyone could refuse a direct command from Coalition High Command. Zekthara held up her hands for silence. General Dan Cooper stood up in the middle of the meeting and said words that are now famous throughout the galaxy. He said, "With all due respect to this council, there are no acceptable losses when those losses are someone's family." She described the argument that followed. Coalition leaders pointed out that a rescue mission would be suicide. The plague swarm had overwhelming numbers and technology that could adapt to any attack. Sending the fleet to defend the 3 systems would mean losing both the civilians and the military forces. General Cooper listened to all their arguments. Then he said something that I will never forget as long as I live. Zekthara stood up, and her voice grew stronger. He said, "If we abandon these people to save ourselves, then we are no better than the enemy we are fighting. A victory built on the graves of innocents is not worth having." She told them how Admiral Mary Hughes had supported Cooper's position. Together, they convinced a small group of human officers to join an unauthorized rescue mission. They knew they would face court-martial if they survived. They knew the odds of survival were almost 0, but they also knew that 12 million civilians were counting on someone to try. The rescue fleet consisted of 47 human ships and whatever alien vessels chose to join them. Zekthara had volunteered to come along, partly out of curiosity, and partly because she was beginning to understand something important about human honor. The journey to the Shattered Worlds took 6 days. During that time, I spent hours talking with the human officers. I wanted to understand why they were willing to throw away their lives and careers for people they had never met. She described her conversation with Captain Alex Wright, commander of the destroyer USS Boston. Wright had 3 children back on Earth and a wife who begged him not to go on the mission. I asked Wright why he did not stay home with his family. Why risk making his children orphans for the sake of strangers? He looked at me like I had asked him why he breathed air. Zekthara's voice became very soft. Wright said, "Commander, those 12 million people have families too. They have children who are afraid and parents who are trying to protect them. If I do not try to save them, who will? And what kind of father would I be if I taught my children that some lives matter more than others? The battle began as soon as the rescue fleet entered the first system. The plague swarm had already consumed most of Kepler-7, but there were still evacuation ships trying to escape with the last survivors. The swarm bioships were like nothing I had ever seen in combat. They moved like living creatures, flowing and adapting instead of flying in straight lines. When we damaged them, they absorbed matter from nearby asteroids to heal themselves. Zekthara described the first phase of the battle, where the human fleet split into 3 groups to cover all the evacuation routes simultaneously. Each group was vastly outnumbered, but they fought with a desperation that surprised even her. Commander Lisa Bell led the escort for the civilian transports. Her ship, the cruiser New York, was one of the most advanced vessels in the human fleet. She could have used its speed to escape when the fighting got too dangerous. She paused to take another drink. Instead, Bell positioned her ship between the transports and the largest swarm vessel. When the bioship began firing plague spores that could infect an entire ship's crew, Bell made a decision that saved thousands of lives. The cantina was completely silent as Zekthara continued. Bell ordered her crew to abandon ship, then set the New York on a collision course with the swarm vessel. She stayed behind to pilot the ship manually, making sure it would hit the right target. She described the explosion that followed, how the New York's reactor detonated just as it struck the bioship. The blast created a gap in the enemy formation that allowed 17 transport ships to escape with over 50,000 civilians. Bell died in that explosion. She knew she would. But she also knew that her death would save more lives than her survival could. The story continued with more acts of human sacrifice. Captain Tony Davis had rammed his ship into a swarm mothership to create an escape corridor. The destroyer Liberty, under Captain Pete Richardson, had used itself as a shield to protect a hospital ship carrying wounded children. Each time a human ship was destroyed, the rest of the fleet fought harder. It was like every death made them more determined to save the people they were trying to protect. Zekthara told them about the evacuation of New Geneva, where engineer Kate Foster had figured out how to modify their ship's engines to create an electromagnetic pulse that temporarily disabled swarm biotechnology. Foster's solution required someone to manually overload a ship's reactor core while staying close enough to the enemy to make sure the pulse would work. It was another suicide mission. She described how 6 different human captains had volunteered for the job, each one arguing that they should be the one to sacrifice their ship and crew. The decision had finally been made by drawing lots. Captain Roy Mitchell won the draw, or lost it, depending on how you look at it. He took his ship, the destroyer Phoenix, straight into the middle of the swarm formation and detonated his reactor. The electromagnetic pulse had worked perfectly, disabling dozens of bioships and allowing the evacuation fleet from New Geneva to escape. But the cost was Mitchell's ship and his entire crew of 200 volunteers. By the time we reached Arcturus, Colony, the human fleet, had been reduced to 18 ships. We had saved over 8 million civilians, but the price had been terrible. Zekthara's voice became heavy with emotion. The final evacuation was the hardest. Arcturus had the largest population, but it also had the strongest swarm presence. The bioships had learned from our previous attacks and adapted their defenses. She described the last phase of the battle, where General Cooper himself led the final assault. His flagship, the battleship Washington, was the most powerful ship left in the human fleet. Cooper used the Washington as bait, drawing the entire swarm fleet away from the evacuation ships. He broadcast a message on all frequencies, taunting the swarm and challenging them to come after him. The plan worked. The bioships abandoned their positions around Arcturus and pursued Cooper's ship into deep space. But there were too many of them, and the Washington could not outrun them all. Cooper's last message was broadcast throughout the fleet. He said, "Tell my wife I kept my promise. Tell the families of Arcturus that their children are safe. And tell the galaxy that humanity does not abandon its own." The Washington exploded in a burst of light that could be seen from 3 star systems away. But the sacrifice had worked. The last evacuation ships escaped from Arcturus carrying the final 2 million survivors. When the rescue mission was over, Only 7 human ships remained out of the original 47. The 5th drink arrived, but Zekthara barely noticed it. She was looking around the cantina with different eyes now, seeing how the other aliens were watching her. Their expressions had changed during her stories. The laughter and doubt from earlier were gone, replaced by something that looked like respect. The rescue at Vega Station, she began quietly. That is where I learned what happens when the galaxy starts to fight like humans. She picked up her fresh drink and held it without taking a sip. This battle happened just 6 months ago. By then, word had spread throughout Coalition space about human military methods. Other species had begun to study their tactics, trying to understand how such a young and weak race could win so many impossible victories. The crystal creature leaned forward. Did the other species learn to copy human strategies? Some tried, Zekthara said, but copying human tactics is not the same as understanding human thinking. You cannot simply pretend to be willing to die for strangers. You cannot fake the kind of honor that makes humans throw away their lives for people they have never met. She set her drink down and stood up. Vega Station was a civilian habitat in neutral space. Over 3 million beings from dozens of different species lived there. It was supposed to be a safe place, protected by international law and far from any military conflicts. Zekthara described how the terrorist group called the Iron Fist had taken control of the station. They were extremists who believed that only the strongest species deserved to survive. Their plan was to destroy Vega Station as a message to the galaxy. The Iron Fist had planted bombs throughout the station's power core. If those bombs exploded, the entire habitat would be destroyed along with everyone on it. They demanded that all weak species abandon their homeworlds and submit to Iron Fist rule. She began pacing around her table, her forearms moving as she talked. Coalition High Command wanted to negotiate. They were willing to make deals, pay ransoms, anything, to avoid a direct confrontation that might trigger the bombs. But the humans had a different idea. Zekthara told them about Colonel Gary Smith, who volunteered to lead a joint task force to retake the station. For the first time in Coalition history, the rescue team included soldiers from over 20 different species, all fighting together under human leadership. I was part of that task force. Smith asked me to serve as his second-in-command, not because I was the highest-ranking officer, but because he said I understood what the mission really meant. She paused and looked directly at the floating gas creature. When I asked Smith what he meant, he said something that showed me how much the galaxy had changed. He said, "Commander, this is not about human honor anymore. This is about all of us learning to fight for each other." The assault on Vega Station began with careful planning. Smith had studied every human battle that Zekthara had described in her stories. He used tactics from Proxima Beta, strategies from the Crimson Nebula, and the humanitarian focus from Theta Prime. But the most important thing Smith did was teach the other species how to think like humans during battle. He spent days explaining why humans made the choices they made, why they valued some things more than victory. Zekthara described the briefing where Smith addressed the Mixed Species Task Force. He had told them that their job was not to be heroes or to copy human methods, but to understand that every life on the station mattered more than their own safety. Lieutenant Colonel Janet Brown was Smith's operations officer. She had developed a plan that could disable the bombs and capture the terrorists with minimal casualties. But the plan required perfect coordination between species that had never worked together before. The story continued with details of the assault. Zekthara told them about Major Frank Miller, who led a team of engineers from 6 different species. Their job was to reach the power core and disarm the bombs while the main force kept the terrorists distracted. Miller's team included a crystalline sapper, 2 Vorthak demolition experts, a Zephyrian computer specialist, and several others. They had to work together using hand signals because their communication equipment might be detected by the enemy. She described how the team moved through the station's maintenance tunnels, each species using their natural abilities to overcome different obstacles. The crystalline could phase through certain barriers, the Vorthaks could tear through metal walls, and the Zephyrians could interface directly with the station's computer systems. But the most important moment came when they reached the bomb site. The Iron Fist had designed the explosives to detonate if anyone tried to disarm them. The only way to stop them was for someone to manually override the system from inside the blast radius. Zekthara's voice grew quiet. It was another suicide mission. Someone had to stay behind to keep the bombs from exploding while everyone else escaped, just like the humans had done so many times before. She told them about the argument that followed. Every member of Miller's team volunteered to be the one who stayed behind. The crystalline engineer said her people owed a debt to the station's civilians. The Vorthak demolition expert argued that his thick shell gave him the best chance of surviving long enough to complete the task. For the first time in my military career, I watched non-human soldiers argue about who should be allowed to sacrifice their life for strangers. They were not copying human tactics, they had learned to think with human values. The decision was made when the Zephyrian computer specialist, a being called Resonance of Stars, simply walked into the bomb chamber and began working on the override system. The others could only watch through the blast doors as Resonance worked to save everyone on the station. Resonance succeeded in disabling the bombs, but the feedback from the system overloaded his neural pathways. He died saving 3 million people he had never spoken to and who would never know his name. Zekthara sat back down and finally took a sip of her drink. The assault team captured the remaining terrorists without any other casualties. The station was saved and millions of civilians went back to their normal lives. But something had changed in the galaxy that day. She described the aftermath of the mission, how news of the rescue spread throughout Coalition space. For the first time, other species began to talk about honor and sacrifice the way humans did. Military academies started teaching human philosophy alongside traditional tactics. I started receiving requests from young officers of every species, asking to serve under human commanders. They wanted to learn not just how humans fought, but why they fought the way they did. The story continued with examples of how human influence had spread throughout the galaxy. Zekthara told them about recent battles where crystalline warriors had thrown themselves in front of enemy fire to protect wounded comrades, where Zephyrian pilots had rammed their ships into enemy vessels to create escape routes for civilians. The humans did not conquer the galaxy with superior weapons or advanced technology. They conquered it with ideas. They taught us that strength without honor is worthless, that victory without compassion is hollow. She stood up and looked around. The cantina at all the different species listening to her story. 6 months ago, I received new orders from Coalition Command. They wanted me to help train the first fully integrated human-alien special forces unit. Soldiers from 20 different species, all learning to fight with human values and human honor. Zekthara described the training program, where humans like Lieutenant Colonel Janet Brown and Major Frank Miller taught alien soldiers not just combat techniques, but the philosophy behind human warfare. Brown told us something on the first day of training that I think explains everything about human military thinking. She said, "We do not fight to prove we are strong. We fight to prove that strength should protect the weak. We do not fight to take things from others. We fight to give others the chance to be free." The training had been difficult, not because the physical challenges were too hard, but because learning to think like humans required changing everything most species believed about warfare and survival. The hardest lesson was learning to value the lives of strangers as much as our own. Most species are taught from birth to protect their own kind first. Humans taught us to protect anyone who needed protection, regardless of what species they came from. Zekthara picked up her drink and held it high above her head. The reason I am telling you these stories is because word has spread throughout the galaxy. Every warrior worth their weapons knows about human courage now. Some species fear them. Others try to copy them, but all of them respect them. She looked directly at each alien in the cantina. The humans have changed how we think about war, about honor, about the value of life itself. They showed us that the strongest warriors are not the ones who kill the most enemies, but the ones who save the most innocents. The cantina was completely silent as Zekthara continued. Tomorrow I ship out on another mission. Coalition Command has detected a new threat in the Outer Rim, something that could endanger millions of civilians. The response team will include humans, Vorthaks, crystallines, Zephyrians, and a dozen other species. She raised her glass even higher. For the first time in galactic history, we will not be fighting as separate species trying to protect our own interests.